Like I mentioned previously, activities are one of the primary building blocks for your applications. And an activity is simply a single screen in your application. So let's say in an email client, if we have the list of emails, that's one activity. When we have the message details for a particular message, that's another activity. The compose screen where you write a new message, that's another activity. So it's really important to grasp and learn the fundamentals of activities. So we're going to create a new Android project, and I'm going to call it Learn Activities. We're going to save it in the default workspace. Again, we're going to be targeting Gingerbread for name of my application. I'll just call it Activities, Package, Com, Lee Brimlow, .activities. We're going to create a main activity, which is the activity that the user sees when they first launch your app. And what I like to do is I always call that main. Min SDK version, we'll just target Gingerbread, and I'm going to click Finish. So like I showed you before, at this point, we actually have a fully working application, a Hello World application. We have our main.java, which is the file that actually extends the activity class that represents our initial main activity. And for the actual content, the visual content, it's referencing a file called main, which is in the layout folder in my resources. So if I go into resources, layout, there we see that main.xml. And by default, it just has hello world main. It just has some text inside of a text view. So I'm going to run that just to make sure it's working correctly. Again, we want to run it as an Android application, and we'll launch up the emulator, and we can see it's running correctly. Okay, so I quickly want to point out a couple of things in the Android manifest file. So we can see here in XML view, inside of our application tag, we have our activity. Now, one of the things you'll see inside of here is this intent filter. We're going to be talking about intents in a lot more detail coming up in another movie, but this basically tells the Android system by putting in this action that this is the activity that should be launched when the application is first launched. And it does that by putting in this android.intent.action.main. So this is basically advertising to the Android system, hey, when you launch me, launch this activity first. And it's this main activity that we have. So again, we're going to get into more details about intents in a little bit. But let's say that I want to add another activity to my application, because usually your application is going to have multiple activities. So we basically need to recreate these two files for a different activity. So first we need to create another Java file that extends activity. So I'm just going to right click in my main package. I'm going to select New, Class, and I'm going to call this one Second. So I'm going to click Browse, and here I'm going to want to extend activity, which is in android.app package. Click OK, and I can just click Finish. So now it's created another Java file called Second, which extends activity. But I also need to override this onCreate method so that I can actually set which UI I want to put into this activity. So I can just come inside of here, give myself some space, start writing onCreate, and hit Control Space. And now we can see this first option will create the override method for me. Now I haven't actually created a new XML file, so I don't have anything to put here yet. So that's the next step. I need to create an XML file similar to main.xml, which is going to hold the UI for this second activity. So this third button here in the toolbar opens up a wizard to help create a new Android XML file. So I'm going to click that. And here I need to give it a name. So I'm going to call this second.xml. Now the naming conventions here they're really strict. So you can't have a capital letter here. You can't have different symbols. It has to be lowercase. So I'm going to put second.xml. And now it's asking us what type of resource would you like to create? Well, I want to create a layout resource, very much like main.xml. So I'm going to choose layout. And now it's asking me what do I want the root element for that XML file to be? essentially what is going to be my root layout container. So there are a bunch of different layout options that you have in Android, and we're going to get to that also in a future movie. But we're going to leave the default as linear layout, which is pretty much the simplest, most standard layout option, where as we add things, they're laid out in a linear fashion, one after another. So we're going to click Finish, and now it's created a new XML file, and here we are in the graphical layout view. So from this point, I can actually just start adding various UI controls to this. So let's say I want, very much like the main.xml, I just want this one to have a text view. So I'm going to drag that out here. We can see there it is. In here, I can actually go into my properties. And let me actually just make this stuck to the side there. Now I can set all the properties for this text view. So if I scroll down, we can see one of the properties here is actually the text property, or what's going to be inside of this text field. What is the text going to say? So I'm just going to change that to, this is the second activity. And that's all we're going to do at this point. So it's going to be very simple. When we get to this activity, it's just going to display this message. If we want to look at what the XML looks like, of course, we can go back and look at that. Now you notice that things are not wrapped nicely. Well, one thing we can do is to right click, go to Source, and then Clean Up Document, and then just click OK. And it's actually going to make things be laid out a little bit better. But again, very much like main.xml, we have a linear layout with a text view. Okay, so now we have the second activity, but we need a way to actually be able to launch it. Because remember, when we first come into the app, we're coming to this main activity. So what we're going to do here is to, first I'm going to delete this text view. And now we're going to put a button in here. So I'm just going to drag this button into the activity. If we want to look at the properties here, we can. The ADT tools will actually automatically give any controls that you drag out here an ID. So you can actually come in and customize this ID, which is how you reference the control throughout your project. But for right now, we're going to leave it at the defaults. So now I have this button. Now I need to actually write the code so that when the user taps this button, it's going to launch the second activity. So I'm going to go to my main.java file. And under where I set the content view, the first thing I need to do is to get a reference to that button control that I put in the XML. So to do that, I'm going to create a button property. I'm just going to call it B, just keep it simple. And then the way in which we can get a reference to UI components in our XML is to use the find view by ID method. And this will actually go out if we give it an ID and return us a reference to that control. So in order to actually get the ID, we're going to want to go to r.id. There you can see our button control with that name that was given by default. So this will now return a reference and save it in this B property that we created. If we hit Control 1 here, we can see it's giving us an error. It will give us a quick fix, which is to add cast to this button. So we're basically casting it to a button control. So now we have a reference to that button stored in this B property. So the next thing we need to do is to set up the on-click listener so that whenever the user clicks that button, we can respond to it and actually cause something to happen in our application. So the way in which we do that is to say b.setOnClickListener. We can see it's the first choice here. So I'm going to select that. And now inside of here, what we're going to do is to create a new on-click listener. So we're going to say new, and I'll just start typing it and then hit Control Space. And we can see it's going to create an anonymous inner event handler in which we can respond to this event. So when I click this, we can see it's automatically created that stub for me. Again, if I hit Control 1, I'll be able to get some quick fixes here. And I just want to import the on-click listener class. And I'll come down here and put a semicolon in. So now inside of this on-click method, This is where I can actually do something when the user has clicked that button. So all I'm going to do is to launch this other activity. So the way in which we start activities is to actually call the start activity method. So to this method, we pass in an instance of the intent class. And the intent class, which we're going to cover a lot more in a future movie, but this actually just broadcasts, hey, I want to activate this particular component or this activity. So we're just going to do it inline here. I'm going to create a new intent. Now there's a bunch of different constructor overrides here that I can pass in. The one we're going to use specifically to launch activities is this one, in which we pass in a context, and then we pass in which class, which represents the activity, do we want to call. So now when it comes to context, this is something that you'll have to use quite a bit as you're doing Android development. So anytime we request to the system to launch something, we send in a context so that that component knows who is requesting it, essentially. So now there's a few different ways to get context. But because we're in an anonymous inner method here, the easiest way to get the context is to just say main.this, which is referencing our main file here. And this basically tells the system that, hey, the main activity is requesting this action. So the next thing we send in is the class of which activity we want to launch. Well, that is second, and then we give it the class property. And then we can close that. So really quick, just to recap, we've gotten a reference to our button, which we defined in our XML here. We've set up the on-click listener. We just did it as an anonymous inner type event handler here. There are other ways to do it as well, which we'll cover when we get to talking more about button controls. When the user clicks, now you'll notice that in Android it says click, even though the user is typically going to be doing it with their finger. It's the same thing. We're just going to start a new activity. We're passing in this intent object, which basically is saying who is requesting this. Well, it's this activity right here, which is main. And then which activity do we want to launch? So let's go ahead and launch that, and we'll save these resources. And let's go to the emulator. So we can see it's launched now. And when I click on the button, now you can see what happens when I launch this is we actually get an error. And it says, sorry, the application activities has stopped unexpectedly. So now this is going to happen to you often during your development. So how do you respond to this and how do you figure out what's wrong? Well, let's go back to Eclipse. Now what we want to do is to go to a different perspective. So right now we're in the Java perspective. If we click this and then go to Other, we can see that there's one specific to Android called DDMS. And this contains a bunch of different tools in which you can monitor how your applications are actually running on the emulator or actually on a real device. One of the most useful areas is Logcat. So as your applications are running on the emulator or a device, they're constantly sending out messages about things. And we can see already that we have a big one in red, which is generally not a good thing. So if we scroll up here, we can see what happened. Fatal exception, main. Activity not found, exception. So it couldn't find that activity that we created. So why was that? It's because we haven't actually added it to the manifest file. So let's go back to the manifest file. Remember, any activity that exists in your application, it needs to be defined here in the manifest file. So all I'm going to do is to create a new activity here. And I'm just going to start typing name and then hit control space, gives me the code hinting. Now for name, we actually need to reference the name of it. So if we hit period, that basically gets us to the end of our default package here. And I'm just going to type in second. And that's all we need to do actually inside of here because we don't need to define any intents. That's all we need to do at this point just to define this activity. Okay, so let's go ahead and relaunch this and go back to our emulator. I'll let this load up. Okay, so I'm going to click this button now. And now you can see it's actually gone to the second activity, but where is the text view which says, hey, this is the second activity. Well, if we go back to our Java file, you'll notice the difference between this and the main one is that we haven't set the content view, which basically tells the activity which XML file to use for its visual content. So what we're going to do is to call set content view and then give the ID of the layout file that we want to use. So to get that, we say r dot and then go to layout, and we want to use the second.xml file here. And with that, we should be done. So let's launch it one last time. There it is. We click the button, and now it's actually showing us the second activity with the visual content from that second XML file. So again, that's what it takes to add a new activity to your application. Again, you're going to be creating a Java file. If you're going to be using XML for the UI, you're going to need to create that. And then a really important part is you need to define it in your manifest file. So we're going to be getting a lot more into activities and how they work with intents, but that's a basic overview of creating activities.